Let's get started. So, you all have chosen to integrate the world's most advanced geospatial data visualization library with the world's most popular JavaScript framework. I'm Tom Wason. This is Renee Rubalcava. We are here to tell you that that is going to work out just fine. We got some tips and tricks to help make that easier, make sure it goes smoothly for you. Let's start by talking about React. The central philosophy of React is that your UI should be a function of state, right? So you tell React about when your state is going to change in your application, what it should look like at any given state, and then React takes care of updating the DOM for you. The central philosophy of the ArcGIS API for JavaScript is you give us an item ID, you give us a DOM node, and we'll show you the world, literally. So conceptually, what these two things look like when they're in your application is you've got this React land over here, and it has state. It renders that state through a tree of components and outputs some DOM. The ArcGIS API has its own state, and it also outputs DOM through views and widgets. So the key to making all this work is to have that little realm of overlap be as little as possible, have a small footprint where the two interact with one another. Like any library that you would integrate into React, you are going to probably want to wrap the ArcGIS API in a component or a couple of components. One thing that is sort of a best practice that you should do specifically with the ArcGIS API for JavaScript is you should also include a separate module that has the functions that are going to touch these classes over here on the right-hand side. And your map component can call into that function. And we'll see why later. But that will be sort of a recurring theme that we have going through here. So to kind of see an example of how this would look, here's a high-fidelity mock-up that you got from your designer saying we're going to do this amazing new app. It's going to do this amazing thing. It's going to have two buttons. When you click one of them, it's going to be a light theme. When you click the other one, it's going to be a dark theme. Oh, and by the way, we want to update the base map to match the theme. You, as a developer, can already start to see this in code, right? So you see that there's an app component. It has some state. That state includes the theme. The app component is going to render a couple buttons that can update that state. And then it's going to render this esri-map component. And that will take the theme as a property, and it's going to render out a div. Now, what that component needs to do is send that div and send a base map based on the theme over to some function that is going to interact with the JavaScript API, create a map. So like we said, we're going to put that function in its own utility. We'll just call it utilsmap.js for the sake, and it's going to return a view. And the component will hold on to that view so that it can update the base map later. So this is the flow of how things are going to work. In order to implement this, you're going to have to know about a few React key concepts in React. So as we said, let's take a look at that map component. And as we said, it just renders a div. This is plain vanilla React right here, nothing special. But in order to access that div after we've rendered it, we need to add what is called a ref. So in the constructor for this component, you'll create a ref, and when you render the component, you'll assign the ref to that div. Now, anytime you want to do anything after you've rendered your component in React, you need to tap into this component lifecycle hook called component did mount. And all we're going to do here is we get a hold of that ref at the first line, and we derive a base map based on the theme. And we're going to send those over to our load map function, which does the work that we saw earlier, and returns the view, and we hold on to that for later. Anytime you want to respond to changes in state in React, you're going to handle the component did update lifecycle method. And that here we just check to see if the theme has changed, and if it has, we update the base map on our view. Finally, because we've held onto that base map, it's always a good idea to make sure you implement one more React lifecycle, which is the cleanup method that happens before the component is destroyed, called component will unmount. And all we do there is just destroy the view to make sure we don't have any memory leaks. Ta-da! That's this code right here. It's a little hard to see, but you are changing the theme up there at the top. And it all works. We've created a map using React DOM and state. We've relayed changes in that state to the JavaScript API, and we've cleaned up after ourselves. So one thing you might be wondering about is, what about taking state from the JavaScript API and passing it back to React? Well, it's really actually just a variation on something that we've just already seen. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is, in this application, let's say that we want to disable those buttons until such time as the map is loaded. That way things don't get out of state, out of sync. We'll add a little bit of state to the app itself called map loaded, and we'll initialize it as false. Then we'll pass that state on down to the buttons, and those buttons will be disabled as long as the map is not loaded. Then we're going to add a callback that will just set that state to true, and pass that callback into the render function. Now all we need to do is add one line to our component did mount. After the view is loaded, we just check to see, was a callback passed in as a property? If so, we call it. And that's it. Now I have the source code for that all up, and we'll take a look at it a little bit later, but really it's not even anything you should pay too much attention to, because this being React, all the APIs I just showed you have already changed. Renee is going to show you how to use the latest and greatest in a minute here, but what's important is those concepts that we talked about, of how you communicate between the realm of React and the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. They're fundamentally the same with the new APIs. So you want to pass state and callbacks from React into that map component, and we're going to pass them in as props. You're going to use refs to access DOM nodes, and you're going to pass those DOM nodes over, and the props that come into that component over into the ArcGIS API. And you're going to want to do that through some kind of module that encapsulates the calls into the ArcGIS API and that uses the classes that you import from the ArcGIS API. Finally, you have to know when you can call the functions, when you can access those functions in that module based on React lifecycle. So you have to know when the component has rendered, when the component has updated. And this is just a matter of just becoming familiar with React. I showed you a couple of lifecycle hooks here, and like I said, Renee is going to show you another APIs that work the same way. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Renee, literally. Hand it over to Renee.
Thank you. All right, so if we're lucky, the rest of this presentation will not be outdated by the time we're done with it. Actually, parts of it might be. I'll mention that when we get to it. So let's talk about some of the modern parts of React, which were just released very recently. So when we talk about magic state in React, a lot of times you're going to work with something like Redux, MobX, there's a couple of regular Flux maybe. So there's a couple of ways you can manage state in large scalable applications that are already available to you, but you might not need it. There's an API that actually Redux and stuff uses under the hood, well they've used for a long time, that was never really public, and that's a context API. And a couple of releases ago, React went ahead and made that a public API, and they made some enhancements to make it much easier to use. So context is really neat. It's a way that you can kind of inject a context for your application anywhere in React that you want to use it. So let me make this a little bigger, just because, yeah, there we go. That's too big. Okay. So the way you do that is that there is a create context method you can bring in. You can create that context, and then you want to start it with some kind of initial properties. So I have a state property, and I have a method called SetState. And you have a bunch of methods. You have a method like maybe a knit my app, a method zoom to location. You have a bunch of different stuff on this context as you want. You define it to do whatever you want to do. I particularly want to have some state on there I can watch, and I'll explain why in a second. Okay, too big. Once you've got that context, you need to create a provider of the context. So how are you going to inject this, well, not inject, but how are you going to make this context available to parts of your React application? So you create this provider, you're going to get children, and when we say children in React, children are always going to be the children virtual DOM nodes that are going to be passed to a function. So you get the children, and then you're going to return the context provider, right? So again, I have my app provider, I'm going to return the context, the provider that's on the context with that. And what I do here is I define an object called value. And that value is going to have my state object, and it's going to have whatever methods I want to be accessible to everything else that's going on here, right? So I pass that value along to my provider. So this is my main application provider, and once you've got the provider, I'm going to wrap my app in that, right? So I'm going to render my React application, I wrap my app part in this provider, and now I'm going to have things available to me in my provider, right? I've got this location part here, and this is like if you do routing, you may have to pass, or I'm sorry, yeah, if you do routing, you want to pass the location for the URL that you're at. This is kind of how you would pass things into your provider, and just render your app. So now, okay, I've wrapped my app in a provider. I've created a context that my provider is using. You have the ability to use a method called use context, right? So I'm going to pull the state and set state method off of my context. So that's what I call them in my context. You can call them whatever you want and use them. But now that I have the set state method available, I can now set the state on my context from within my React component. And this is much different than what we saw Tom show, where we created a React class that extended the React component. We're not doing that. It's a function that's just called awesome app, and this function has this UseEffect method. So UseEffect is a newness that's come out of React, and these are called hooks. And you can only use these hooks inside of a function that returns React components, virtual DOM nodes, essentially. So I've got a map container that I'm going to pass a web map ID to, and I have a reference that's going to be my map ref. And you saw Tom do this with a create ref method because it's a hooks. Hooks will always start with use and then what they do. So there's a use hook, use ref hook, that is going to be a type of HTML div element. It's going to be null to start with, but then when I pass as a ref to this component, my map ref here, when that updates, I'll have access to that to do something, right? So I set state from my context, this map ref, the current map ref that I have. This will, and when we say, a lot of times we see use ref used, they're used a lot for grabbing the result DOM element from a React component. They don't need to be. I mean, they don't need to be DOM elements. They could be anything. It could be a number, it could be a Boolean, it could be a string, it doesn't matter what the useRef is. Just that current property is always going to be the most current reference you have. It's kind of a way to keep references to things inside of React components, right? So it's just really handy for grabbing the DOM element that is created by a React component that you can use for a map view, for example. So this is how you would use your context in your app. And I'll show you something a little bit more involved in a moment. So what the hook, right? So these are the hooks that are available for you in React. There's a lot of different hooks. I won't cover them all. I'll just cover some of the ones that are the most commonly used. So we have this useRef and we have useContext. There's useEffect, which we kind of saw. There's useState, useContext. There's useReducer. There's useLayoutEffect, which you probably will never use. And I don't know if I explain why, but when I get to useEffect, I'll explain it. So when you use useEffect, and when we saw Tom do extending a React component, we were looking at like component did mount, component will unmount to do cleanup. UseEffect kind of wraps all these different React life cycles. Well, it's kind of a replacement for the React life cycles, right? So when UseEffect runs, you can do something. That means that the render method is getting called and something is going to happen. UseLayoutEffect happens right after the render method is called, and you typically don't need it, right? Just use UseEffect, because you'll get some weird behavior if you use LayoutEffect when you don't really need it. So we do UseEffect. For example, I've got a watcher of some sort, and this is something to tell me that something happened. If my watcher is already defined, then I'll just return. I don't want to run this UseEffect function. But if not, then I want to go ahead and watch for the map view to be stationary. And when the stationary changes, I'm going to do something. And the return from a UseEffect is going to be a function that is going to do whatever cleanup you need to do. In my case, I need to remove the watch handle on my map view so that it can be garbage collected later on, right? Because I don't want to keep watching the map view changes. There's no more map view. It'll get destroyed once this component is destroyed. And then the other thing you can do for UseEffect to watch for property changes is any property in the array as a second argument to UseEffect. If that property changes in the React component lifecycle, the UseEffect hook will get run again, right? And if it's empty, it only gets run once, the first time it renders. It won't get run again. So that's one way you can kind of make sure you're doing things correctly with that. There is a situation if you do routing where the UseEffect will get run multiple times, but that's because you've changed routes and technically the component's been destroyed. So when you route back, the component gets spun up again, so that render method gets spun up again, then UseEffect will happen again. So you have to kind of, when you're doing routing, you got to kind of manage state a little bit more carefully if there's things happening between these components that are impacting your application state, for example. Just make sure that you're watching the correct properties and stuff. UseState. So this is kind of how you manage local state in a React component. So you call the UseState hook, pass it some sort of value, and then you're going to get back so we're doing array destructuring, if I haven't explained this. This is array destructuring. UseState actually returns an array with two objects in it. One's going to be the state object, and the other one's going to be the setter for your state object. It doesn't matter what you call them. That's why they did it this way instead of as an object. You can call them whatever you want. So I call it ready and set ready. And then when at some point during my application lifecycle, I can call set ready true, and that's going to update the state for my local React component. UseState is typically meant for things like strings, booleans, and numbers, right? You could use it for objects though. So I can create an initial state, have some properties on there for like arrays and an extent maybe, and I can use the SetState method to update that UseState at some point down the road. Yes, you can do it. You're going to find as your state might get a little bit more complicated and maybe you have some nested properties, you might be better off using a UseReducer and working with a dispatch to kind of manage that. It just, I like to do it with UseReducer just because I already know ahead of time that I'm going to be doing a lot of things with my state, so it just kind of helps me out. But if you have a simple app, UseState might be perfectly valid for what you're going to do. Use context. So we kind of already covered this one. This is something that could replace your Redux, MobX kind of state management. It's really useful because every time that context value, my state changes, it will go ahead and it notifies any components that are using that context that the state has changed via the UseEffect hook or something. So if I watch for the state property change in the array of my UseEffect hook, or state.layers or state.x, state.y, when that does update, the UseEffect hook will see that, and then I can go ahead and run whatever I'm trying to do inside my UseEffect hook that's going to change something. And we'll see some more samples of how that works. So this is just a sample that we saw earlier using UseContext to do stuff. The other new stuff that's in React is Suspense. So again, hold your suspense, right? So basically, and I don't know why they named it Suspense. I'm hoping it's because, hold your suspense. But it's a way that React can lazy load React components. So they're asynchronously loaded React components, which is really useful because maybe you're not routing, maybe you just have parts of a single page application that when someone clicks on a button, maybe you're going to show employee images, right? You don't show them until they click on the button, but you want that component that displays images to show up at some point on that page, right? So you can use a suspense and lazy loading to do that. So the way you do that is you use this lazy method. That's going to return import of your component. You wrap it in suspense, and then whenever it's needed, it'll just pop up when you're going to use it. You have this property for fallback, and that fallback can be like a placeholder component. Maybe it's an image, maybe it's just some text. Doesn't really matter. It'll just show that fallback until that component is loaded and ready to go. And I'll show some more in-depth example once I finish these slides up here. So the other key when you're using React with the JavaScript API is to modularize your API usage. Essentially, you want to create an abstraction layer for the map. You create this abstraction layer for the map that doesn't know anything about the UI. Your React components don't know anything about the map. And they just talk to this abstraction layer. And that abstraction layer is going to load the map, it's going to interact with the map, it's going to zoom to the map, query the map, and do everything else you want to do. So here I have a function called initialize that I'm going to export from some helper method, right? This helper method doesn't know about React. It doesn't have any React in it at all. This helper method is going to load my API, it's going to load my maps, my views, and this initialize method is waiting for an element. And that element is just going to be the container that's on my view. And then I wait for the view to be done doing something, or when it's done drawing, and I can start doing something with it. So it's easy. It's completely separate. Separating the content from the navigation. Now in my component, I can go ahead and when I have a load map method here, and it's an async method, and it's going to go ahead and import that helper module, right? And the helper module has an initialize method that I'm going to call the container on. That container is part of my state management for my component. And then in my UseEffect, when that container is not null anymore, when it's actually been defined by my use refs and everything else I'm doing in my component, when it's ready to go, I can go ahead and call my load map method. And that load map method is going to go ahead and initialize, kick off my view to start drawing everything. So this could be useful in an application where you might have different pieces of your UI that need to be ready right away. And once they're ready, then you can start displaying the map to do something. So why lazy load the API? So Webpack can create asynchronous bundles. It's kind of what Webpack does, right? Webpack is going to create one bundle that may depend on a second bundle that may at that point load a third bundle, right? It's kind of what Webpack does. And it's a way for you to lazy load the resources so you need them. Like I said, it's useful if you have parts of your page you don't need to display React components for right away, especially if you have parts that don't need to show a map right away. You don't want to have the API loaded until you need it. It leads to faster load times. So let me go ahead and show you a demo here. We have a new example app on the developer side called Nearby Places for JavaScript, right? So what Nearby Places does is it starts off on a mobile device anyway. It starts off as a list of restaurants or coffee shops nearby you. And then when you click on one of those coffee shops, it's going to go ahead and show you a map for the location for that shop. Then you can get directions there, and you can do all kinds of really cool stuff. Right? So it's on GitHub, free for you to look at. It's a pretty comprehensive app. I probably spent way more time with this than I had to because React changed about 3 times while I was writing it. So let me go and show you the app real quick. Let's come down here. There is a live demo here. So the interesting thing with this is that on a desktop browser, you get this list and map view. But if I do this right, on a mobile device, and let's change this to an iPhone because there we go. Mobile device, you're just going to get a list of the places to eat first, and then you can start doing stuff with it. And I think it's still loading, but if I go to my map, there we go. So now it's loading because why not? So here are the places to eat, and then maybe we want to go to what's this corner deli here, click on that, and it's going to go ahead and zoom to that location on my map, and I got my pop-up. As you pan the map around, you have the option to search for more places if you want to. That goes away after 10 seconds. I thought 10 seconds was too long. I got overruled, but whatever, not bitter. You can change the filter on this thing. It's got a lot of really cool stuff you can do. Anyway, you can log in and then you can start getting direction. It's a cool little app. It does a lot of cool stuff. It's got a lot of React in it. So here's what the default view looks like. I'm lazy loading the map and the view inside of a layout. This is when I'm on a desktop browser. When I'm not on the desktop browser and I'm on a mobile device, that's when I use routing. Now this looks kind of, maybe look a little intimidating because there's a lot going on here, but essentially I've got a theme that I provide for my apps. This is a theme provider. You'll see theme providers used a lot when you talk about context with React. It's just a real popular way to do it. So I can define colors for things. Then I've got this location, which is part of, it's another URL that gives me my actual location for the URL that I'm on. And then I've got my app provider. Remember, I got my app provider here, and then I have a container. Now in here, I've got Suspense wrapping some media query stuff. And basically, if I am on a smaller device, I want to use routing. So that's where this router comes in. And if I'm not on a smaller device, then I want to just go ahead. Let's show both the layout that's going to have both my map and my list at the same time. There's a lot going on here, pretty powerful. But then I have a method here. So we got stuff for data, which is going to have the map stuff. So this is where all the JavaScript API stuff happens. But there's, again, I'm not bringing any React stuff in here at all. This is all JavaScript API. And the other interesting part about this is, well, let's go to the hooks. The hooks is what's doing all the heavy lifting here. So the hooks is doing all the communication between the JavaScript API part and the React part. So this is where all of my methods for, what's my current position is done. These are all the kind of the proxy calls between the context and that data utility that I showed you. The other cool thing you can do is you can do custom hooks, right? So if I want a custom hook, I create a use web map hook. That's going to have use state, use context. I have some helper methods in here. This app will change the base map based on time of day. So if you're driving at night, it'll update that for you, which is kind of cool. I like it. Hope you all like it. And then I've got things to update the items shown on the map. And I'm going to use my UseEffect hooks in here. And what I return is going to be an array that's going to return the container for my map, which I need to set my whole map view, and a method to update the state for my container, right? Those are the two things I return in an array that I can then use inside my React components. So that's all really cool stuff you can do. Like I said, look at this app. It's got some really cool things. Here's my Suspense lazy loading the map parts of my application, my map components that are displaying the map. So again, not only lazy loading the API, I'm lazy loading the components that are going to use the lazy loaded part of the API to really get some powerful stuff going here. Now, I have a PWA session tomorrow, I want to say, where I cover this app in a lot more detail as well. And I show you some tips and tricks for working with this as a PWA kind of an app. So I'm going to give it back to Tom over here. It's going to talk about some other cool stuff with React and JavaScript. Right, Tom? It's cool, right?
I am indeed. How's everybody doing? Is everyone like a little...
That's a lot.
Brain melting right there? There's a lot going on in that nearby app. It's pretty incredible. So one of the things that I expected Renee to talk about was the ArcGIS Webpack plugin.
Yes.
And what this does is it's a plugin that you can use with your Webpack to build those bundles and everything and make it so that you can use the ArcGIS API sort of like you would any other library. You can import, and like he said, you've got he showed you that his util function that had, where he was making those import statements. This is very cool, and you should use it if you can, but you need to ask yourself a few questions. Are you using JS API 4.7 plus, right? 4.7?
Yes.
It won't work earlier than that. And you also have to be able to configure Webpack. And what I mean by that is not just have the know-how of how to configure Webpack, but also want to be able to configure Webpack. For example, there's a lot of popular React frameworks and tools out there nowadays that insulate you from having to deal with Webpack at all. You're probably familiar with Create React App. React doesn't really have a CLI per se, but this is as close as it gets. It's sort of an official tool from Facebook to bootstrap and start a new React app. It's a great tool for if you're just learning React. It's a great place to learn React, great place to try things out. You can also use it for small to medium production applications. There's also sort of what I would call micro frameworks that sit on top of React, or sort of meta frameworks like NextJS and Gatsby, and those are not created necessarily by React itself, the React team at Facebook, but are just tools for building applications that have their own specific sort of opinions about how an application should work. And one thing that all of these have in common is that by default, they don't really give you access to Webpack. They want to insulate you from that. You just sort of npm install and go, and you get to just get to the good stuff, right? The stuff that you care about. So if you are someone who is using an older version of the ArcGIS API, or you don't have access to your Webpack config because you're using a tool like that, or if you just don't want to, like me, configure Webpack, we got a solution for you. There's a package called esri-loader, which you can download and install into your app that will work for all of these situations. So it works for JavaScript API 3x and 4x. It also is going to work with any React tool and library. So any of those starting points that I showed earlier, those frameworks and tools, you can use with esri-loader. It works with all the other libraries that are out there, Redux and all the other things, React Router. By the way, it's not just for Webpack and React. Esri-loader works with any module loader, even the weird ones. It also works with any framework. There's an interesting one on the end of that list. So what's it like to use esri-loader? Well, to begin with, in terms of integrating it into Webpack, it's pretty easy. You just npm install esri-loader, or if Yarn is your thing, you just yarn add esri-loader, and that's it. There's no configuration after that. When you're working with it at the React level inside your application, what you get is a function called load modules. Not surprisingly, load modules loads modules from the ArcGIS API. And so instead of importing from esri/map or /view/map view, you just import this load modules function, and then you can call that somewhere inside your code. And this might look familiar to you, and if you squint, you might see, if you've done any work with Dojo in the past, this looks just a lot like a Dojo require function. And in fact, that's what it's doing under the hood. So it's not just doing Dojo require, otherwise it'd be pretty lame for me to make a package that just does that. It's going to do that lazy loading that Renee talked about. So that's something that he's already explained how important that is to lazy load the ArcGIS API. It's so important that I felt it should be the default behavior of esri-loader. So by default, it's going to, if the JavaScript API has not been, script tag has not been injected in the page, the first time you call load modules, it will. You don't have to worry. Subsequent calls to load modules will not cause it to inject more script tags. That would be bad. And so just like that, without having to do anything, you get that lazy loading. If you think that your application doesn't need to lazy load the JavaScript API, please come up and talk afterwards. I really like to understand your use case and tell you why you're wrong. So another thing that the esri-loader does will help you lazy load your CSS. So you can pass options as the second parameter to lazy loader, esri-loader, and that will you can pass in the URL to the CSS, and it will. So that's just an additional performance, loading performance enhancement there. And this may make you wonder, well, wait a second, if if it's lazy loading modules by default, if it's loading the JavaScript by default, where is it loading it from if you didn't pass the options? And that's a good question. So by default, it's going to load the latest version of the JavaScript API from the CDN. But again, like we talked about earlier, it doesn't have to be that way. You can use this option parameter to pass in a URL to any version of the JavaScript API hosted anywhere. So not just on the CDN, but if you're working inside of some environment that doesn't have access to the outside world, you've got your own version of the SDK hosted somewhere, you can just point the URL to that. The lazy loader, the esri-loader documentation is full of additional examples, sort of advanced patterns that you can use, like if you need to configure Dojo with certain packages, or if you need to use types in ArcGIS, and more, you can go to the documentation and see how to see those examples. So let's take a look at an example of how you can use esri-loader. Now, this may look familiar. This is that demo we talked about earlier, and one of the bits of code I didn't show you was that load map function. And part of the reason for that is because it's using esri-loader, and I didn't want to complicate things, but we can take it apart right now. The first takeaway that you should get from looking at this slide is, wait, what the what? Wait, what the what? That is running inside of this slide deck right now. The JavaScript API, React, Webpack, it's all happening live inside here. This is an amazing tool called Code Sandbox, which is a great place if you're trying to explore or just do some proof of concept work. It's a great resource, and you can iframe it right into a slide deck if you want. And the thing is, that's one of the things you can do with esri-loader because it is such a sort of simple thing. All you have to do to add it to say something like this or JSBin is just include it in your dependencies right here, and boom, all of a sudden you have the JavaScript API. This is really useful if you just need to do some proof of concept work. So here's that load map function. I'm going to try and, this is where it's all going to fall apart. I'm going to try and increase the text size here. Ooh, ooh. Ooh. Hey, it kind of worked. And there we have that load modules. We're calling in those two things. We loaded the CSS lazily as well. And there's the code that we showed in the very beginning there, this sort of code just to create a map and return it. So the rest of this is, now let's see if I can get back to the rest of the application. We kind of already looked at a lot of the map component code. It is using the lifecycle hooks and the sort of older, like as in like last month, React APIs for creating refs and all that sort of thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. You can use those with either method. It's sort of you can use esri-loader with refs and all the new APIs, or you can use the older APIs with the Webpack plugin. There's no constraints there. You can do React how you want to do React and do the JavaScript API how you want to do the JavaScript API. I'm going to take a look at another couple of examples. So I've created this, esri-loader is not just for sort of code sandbox and JSBin and that sort of thing. You can build real production apps out of it. In fact, we're using it behind the scenes in the ArcGIS Hub, and there's, it works fine in production. I've got another example app here. So we talked about having these, the Create React app as a sort of way to kickstart your React development. And I created this app that searches for ArcGIS Online items and then returns them as a list and then shows a map of their extents. And I created it in both Create React app and NextJS. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about NextJS is that one of its core competencies is doing server-side rendering. So by default, it's going to render your code on the server and return a HTML that has the content of your page. This is really good for SEO, and depending on your backend and how you have everything set up, it can be really good for performance. Now, The JavaScript API can't be run in Node, so you don't want to render a map on the server, but by using these lifecycle hooks like component did mount or UseEffect, React will by default not run that code in the server. Anything that runs after render, it's not going to run it in the server. So you could render a placeholder image or something like that, and then when the app is fully loaded and hydrated on the client, boom, the map loads and becomes interactive. So we'll take a look at that right here. So here's this app written in NextJS, and like I said, you search for something here, like water, and you get these results. And what happened behind the scene, like I said, this table and everything down here was rendered on the server, which is great for SEO. The map, you couldn't see it because it all happened too quickly, but after the page was loaded, it was, the map was listed. So here, if we go look for something like this, something unique that we should expect to see in the DOM, like state of bathing waters old, that sounds like a fun thing. Sorry if that's anybody's item here. But we can see that was here in the DOM. So, the DOM was actually, we have this injected here. So, esri-loader is a way to help you do stuff in sort of very in the JS bin or fiddle or something like that, just proof of concept, all the way to doing something that's, very sophisticated production ready code. If you combine this with some of the techniques that René is going to show with progressive web apps, you can build lightning fast, very performant applications with the JavaScript API. So I think those are really just about it that I have for examples. René is going to show you a little bit more.
Yeah, I think in our updates I deleted my Webpack reminder slide. So let me show you just a little bit, but it's not even a lot. So like the stuff I showed and everything, the only configuration for our Webpack plugin is initializing it, right? There are options with our Webpack plugin, like whether or not you want us to handle loading the assets, because we automatically do, because it's built in to our Webpack plugin to handle our CSS and images and whatever else. But you don't have to let us do that. So just set that to false, and you can handle all that on your own. This particular app that I showed you earlier does it because it does some things with images as well already. But the doc for the plugin is up on GitHub, and the whole thing. The only thing that you would need to set up is the worker stuff, and this is one of the things that we're still working on with the API. So the workers with our Webpack plugin still need to be run via the CDN, right? Which isn't too much of a big deal because they're loaded behind the scenes anyway. And there are some technical reasons for that, mostly with the fact that Webpack's worker support, it's not great, let's say, right? So we may have to write a plugin just to handle workers for our stuff in the future anyway. Which is fine, like I said, the CDN is just great. We support all the different locales and everything like that, and you'll have a good time. So there's some documentation on that and everything right there. The CDN's great to use, whether like using esri-loader, building regular apps, because we have a lot of optimizations that we do in the CDN. So with 4.11, the compression for the CDN is going to be in Brotli, which is going to save us a little bit of size there. We're constantly working on the build for the CDN to kind of optimize the start files, like the map view and things like that, to kind of get those down to the minimal builds. So those updates that we're doing, combined with like esri-loader to build your apps, along with some other PWA stuff, is going to get you some really great, nice-looking apps and everything. And again, the Webpack stuff, we're constantly updating that and getting more features into that and optimizing kind of the way that we do things and stuff. So just like Tom said, it just kind of depends how you want to build your app. If you're using a CLI in any sense, then yes, use esri-loader, because you're just not going to have any, you're not going to be happy trying to eject an app or do anything with the Webpack config. Angular CLI has a custom TypeScript compiler loader that they use to do things that I have no idea what's happening. I've yet to figure it out, so do not ask me about Webpack with the Angular CLI, please. Use esri-loader, because that's going to be my answer. Do you have some more to show?
Yeah, just to,
All right, here's it.
real quick, and not that this slide is so amazing and compelling, but just, and there it is. I think the point is we threw a lot at you, a lot of different ways to work with React and Webpack. And part of the takeaway message should be you don't have to do it a specific way if you constrain that interface between the two of them kind of in the ways that we mentioned. Keep the footprint small, keep the code that references JavaScript API modules in a single file or just a few files and sort of isolate it, put it in the corner of your app. It's going to make things a lot more testable. It's going to make things make it easy to do the lazy loading regardless of which way you're loading the modules, esri-loader or the Webpack plugin. And do what you do. It's never been a better time to be a React developer. It's never been a better time to be a ArcGIS API developer. And we're out here on GitHub to help you out, make it work. Thanks a lot. I think we got time for questions.
I think. Anybody got questions? There's a mic if you want to get up. Yeah? Who's got?
You want to?
You can get the mic or shout out. Speak it loud. Tough to hear up here. Okay, I got you.
Yes.
So the question was, with esri-loader, can I avoid having to reject my create React app? And Tom said the answer is yes.
Yes. Yep.
So it sounds like when you use the Webpack configuration to have Webpack use AMD to load your modules, that loading is happening at build time rather than at app runtime. And so in that case, you're not using lazy loading. Is that correct?
No. So if you use our Webpack plugin, what's happening under the hood is that we use another plugin that at build time essentially lazy loads. Well, it uses AMD to load all of the modules, and it just pumps them into the Webpack build time. And then Webpack does what Webpack does to create all the bundles. So that's why if you use our plugin, we generate something like 80 bundles because of all the dynamic loading that we do. That is part of your deploy, but you'll never use all 80 bundles. You'll use 10 or 12 in your app, right? So you still get all dynamic loading in your application.
Think of it this way, that module we talked about for isolating your code, it's going to pull, like Renee said, it's going to import 10 JavaScript API modules, map and graphic and all that kind of thing. And Webpack is going to trace those, traverse the dependencies, and build a bundle out of that, right? Now, as long as you use dynamic import for that module, now you've got the same level of lazy loading as you would have with esri-loader. So if you lazy load that module, now the JavaScript API has not touched the page until you need the map, until you lazy load that module using dynamic import. Does that make sense?
I see. So in that case, you're still lazy loading, but you're loading from your bundle rather than from ArcGIS.JavaScript.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So both of what we said is true. It does traverse that. It does create bundles, but when you bring those bundles into your app is up to you.
I see. Thanks.
So I think I can show that. Let me see the.
We can take another question while. Yes, sir. All of them. So I forgot to show. I was going to mention. So obviously with React, tests are run in Jest. Your assertions are done in Jest. There's not really a lot of getting around Jest. I have been using a React testing library on top of that to test components, and you can, by doing this lazy loading, using either one, you can actually write tests for map components. You just mock out that the module that we talked about, your interface, your little own API into the JavaScript world. You mock that out, or if you need to test functions inside of that module with esri-loader, you mock out the load modules function. Have it return some spies, and it works great.
Yes, all the testing libraries pretty much work the same. They all have either some sort of an assertion that you do, And then there's a handful of React testing libraries for testing React components. I was using Enzyme for a little while, but I've moved on to the React testing library. I just think it's an easier API to work with for testing. So yeah. So I wanted to show here the way that the lazy loading works. So here's the app on my initial route of list, right? So I've loaded 12 bundles for a total of, it's 2.2 kilobytes, right? It's real small. It's a bunch of bundles just being loaded just to display this little list here. I think that number's right. We'll see that right now. Now when I go to my map, now I'm loading more, right? So this is where I need to load the vector tiles and all this other stuff happening here. I've loaded 29 total. So I've loaded an additional 17 bundles to display my map. So the initial load, I only needed 12. I don't need all 29 files. So I don't care. So at that point, now I get to load. And then I get to see, because the time changed, you get to see my base map change and my icons, right? That's real cool. I'm real proud of that feature. It's really, really neat. No one cares, but I like it.
This is an awesome app. I've been playing with it.
Yeah, so, okay, there we go. Yeah.
That's the one. We're supposed to show that
we
slide.
were supposed to show this slide.
Yeah.
So, oh, yes, another question. Okay.
Well,
so
but you got to rate the app first. I want to see everybody rate the session.
Do the survey.
Raise your hand once you've rated the session, then we'll go back to the title.
Then we'll give you the URLs, but yeah. No, okay, let's go. Let me just go here.
Any other questions while we're going back in time?
Anything else? No? All right, awesome. And we'll be at the various islands all week and stuff, and we've got more sessions during the week. There is another React session tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
Ryan Watkins, Ahmed Al-Husseini are doing a React session on bootstrapping your apps with React, which is really cool. They've done a lot of really cool stuff with React in their group. They're going to be covering more Redux and Thunk stuff in their session. So that's kind of a neat thing. So if you're interested in Redux with JavaScript API, I definitely would check that one out. And they're going to have some really cool stuff in their things, especially how to bootstrap an app with React, which is nice. All right, cool. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.